next in our Pakistan at 100 podcast series. It's a pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Sanjay Kathuria, who is lead economist of Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank. He has a doctorate from Oxford University and a master's from the Delhi School of Economics. He's also one of the key authors and editors of the new World Bank group report named Glass Half Full, which looks at the potential of trade in South Asia. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, really. I'm
so
delighted to be here.
Thank you. So let's just start with a basic question for our audience, which is, how does trade create wealth?
Yeah, so trade creates wealth through, in economist parlance, we say we respond to the principle of comparative advantage. So you produce what you're good at, I produce what I'm good at, rather than us trying to produce everything. And then we exchange and we are both better off. That's the fundamental, simply put. And normally what you have is better jobs. Trade has better jobs than in purely domestic sector production, because they are international firms who are trading and exporting. They are under higher scrutiny, and they also have to be more efficient. Because they are more efficient, they can actually afford to pay better wages. So, and we have also seen that if you look at the Growth Commission, this is a report done by the World Bank, led by the World Bank, but Michael Spence, later a Nobel laureate. Most important thing was that all high growth episodes globally of countries that grew very fast, I think over 7% for 25 years, none of them had this high growth without a deep linkage with international trade.
And so let's just then start talking about trade in South Asia. What does it look like today?
The South Asian trade is a sorry state, actually. We've documented in our report that current trade in goods is only about $23 billion, and through gravity models, which is econometric estimation, basically it could be at least 3 times as much, $69 billion or $67 billion, and that is an underestimate. It could actually be much more than that, because this is a static model, and it also doesn't include trade in services like tourism or medical or education and all of that. It doesn't include that. So this is the lower bound of the possibilities for South Asia. So there is a huge gap between current trade and potential trade, which also means, following from your first question, it means there is a huge welfare loss for the populations of the countries involved. Globally, neighbors, the post-prosperous regions in the world, when you think about North America, European Union, or East Asia, they all trade very intensely with their neighboring countries. South Asia, our trade is less than 5% or around 5% of our total trade, the trade within the region. And that's way too low. That's the lowest in the world of any major region. And yet, South Asia is growing faster than any other region in the world. And therefore, growth means trade possibilities. So the gap between current trade and potential trade has, since this century, this millennium, actually has been growing. The gap has been just growing and growing.
So let me make sure we're understanding, all of us, this well. So what you're saying essentially is that when large countries exist close to one another, that because the economy is of a larger size, that there are more opportunities for them to find profitable exchanges that can be made across borders than smaller economies. That should be intuitive for economists and non-economists alike. What else goes into figuring out the potential of trade between two countries?
So that's a very good question. So basically what we call it's an intuitive concept called gravity. It's called gravity models. But the gravity models, the most important components of gravity are GDP, which means the economic overall size of a country, and also distance between two countries. Also, if you have shared borders and if you have a common language, then the potential trade increases even further.
Right.
So now, if you look at, say, India and Pakistan, so for Pakistan, India is obviously, the gravity pull of India is much larger than vice versa. So Pakistan has a huge potential export to the larger country, but Pakistan is not small either. So India also has large. So our model is estimating roughly around 19 to 20 billion dollars exports for each country were they to fulfill the trade as the rest of the world, because this model is fact based. It's based on actual trade data. So if India and Pakistan were to trade with each other, just as any other trading relationship, the average trading relationship in the world, then, so I'm not saying you have to aim for the moon, just like any other normal trading relationship in the world, which obviously it is not, then they would be exporting to each other roughly 19 to 20 billion dollars each way. So it's not only one way, they're roughly, our model is predicting about 19 to 20 billion dollars export on both sides. So,
and can you contextualize that? How large a number is that?
So currently trade between the two countries is about $2 billion, the formal trade, and we're saying a total of about $37 billion is the potential.
So,
and that, by the way, if you add this gap in Pakistan's exports to India, current total Pakistan's exports are, I understand, around $24-25 billion. If you add the potential exports of India, it would become more than $40 billion. So imagine the huge potential right at the neighborhood.
So let's just do a thought experiment. Let's say that we could remove all the security dilemma, all of that, the tensions between the two countries, and let's say that we could erase the border, erase the fences on the border. So now you can have, a fertilizer company with an outstation in Amritsar that's selling in Kasur, and you can have a textile company based in Faisalabad, selling its wear in Patiala, let's say. What would that do to sort of the industry within our boundaries?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Excuse me. So what actually does, so I would take another example. So, the most dynamic elements of world trade today are in this so-called value chains, which means, to simplify it means trading at the intermediate level, trading in parts. So instead of trading in, say, garments, I'm also trading in fabric and yarn and raw cotton. Instead of just trading cars, I'm trading in auto components, steering wheels, pistons, carburetors, tires, all of that. So, and that is the most dynamic element in world trade. And what it means is, for example, a firm in Amritsar, instead of getting its yarn from, say, Coimbatore, which is, thousands of kilometers away down south in India, could just get it from across in Lahore instead of having to. So the dynamic possibilities that are created by collapsing of the economic borders are huge. We cannot even begin to contextualize or understand this. These figures that I'm talking about are non-dynamic. They are static.
Sure.
If they're dynamic, there is potential is huge. And what is the I think a major argument here is the dividend, the externalities from this, the peace dividend, not merely in terms of expenditures of defense that are reduced, but there is another peace dividend which is creating constituencies for peace through the business lobbies, so that you find it more difficult to go back. Once this trade happens, let's say it happens through some magic wand, then it becomes much more difficult to go back to the old ways, because now you have very entrenched good lobbies now wanting to preserve that business that is across the border.
If you're doing business with your neighbors, it's bad to hurt them, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Well, so worldwide, sort of trade has raised red flags in all sorts of countries. President Trump famously has been talking about the Mexican Wall. But there are other examples, Brexit being one. This is sort of based on fears about trade. Can you tell us what if Pakistan was to create a free trade, or Pakistan and India together were to create a free trade regime, what would be the economic hurt on both sides?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important question in today's global environment, because precisely the issue is about taking care of those who are left behind. Because in any economic policy, and more so in trade policies, there are winners and losers, right? And because here the winners and losers are created by the international market, so it becomes more political. So yes, so there are ways of doing trade liberalization through processes that minimize the dislocation and maximize the upside. So you as a policymaker, you have to take care of both. You have to make sure that you're winners. You have suddenly got a big market next door, but do you have the capacity to meet the demands of that market? So how do you help them? Your business climate, your supply of products at world prices, your tariffs should come down so that inputs are cheap, so that you can get the best possible prices for inputs so that you can export. All of that. But then you must also take care of those sectors that are vulnerable, and make sure that, so there are several ways to do it. One of them is backload. That means don't liberalize them on day one. Do it, announce it, pre-announce it, because it's important to pre-announce it, but liberalize it 10 years in the future, or whatever figure you choose, 10 years, 15 years. So have a slow incremental liberalization of sensitive sectors, so that they have enough time to prepare for this, coming wave of imports. And, similarly, the other country, India, would have, if this is the Pakistan case, India would also have to do the same, prepare both on increasing exports and facing up to competition from Pakistani imports. And it's win-win for the economies as a whole. That's why it's done, because we started with that premise, trade is good for the economy as a whole. But the problem in the world is that those who are dispossessed, those who are the so-called the losers in this, have had a disproportionate voice, and they have been able to, currently in world trade, they have a very loud voice. And so we have to make sure that we anticipate this. We have now the benefit of these undercurrents in world trade, and we have to make sure that we do the most diligent homework, analysis, policy and preparation, so that those who are going to lose get opportunities for the labor especially. It's the jobs that we should be most concerned about, that they should be able to move to other sectors. There are safety nets in place, so till they find other jobs, and retraining and all of those. There is a toolkit for economists to take care of those.
You touched upon sensitive sectors.
Yes.
What do India and Pakistan think are sensitive sectors? How do you define a sensitive sector or sensitive list?
So, there is a very long list on both sides. I think Pakistan has currently a negative list for Indian imports for over 1,200 products. Earlier it was a positive list. That means only those products could be imported.
Right.
So it moved a step further, better, in converting a positive into a negative list. So a lot of products are there. There is sort of agriculture as well, some agricultural products. So a lot of products actually go from India to Pakistan via third countries,
right.
And then they enter. So there is a cost to that. There is a huge cost to that. So I think India also, Pakistan is very competitive. I don't know the exact sectors, but certainly in India it's not outright banned, but it is, the tariffs are normal. It's not concessionary tariffs under SAFTA. So I think there are a whole bunch of textile products there, because Pakistan is very competitive in textile products. But the point here is that if there is, say, a genuine negotiation to bring down this sensitive list on both sides, then it is something that can be tackled. It is not unsurmountable. And there are a few sectors which continue to be very sensitive on both sides. It's fine. You can keep that for the very end, 15 years down the line for liberalization. It's entirely possible. It's done. Free trade negotiations, that's what it's all about.
But sort of, if you look at these lists, I understand sort of arms trade would be the extremely sensitive thing, right? That's something that I can't imagine being traded between India and Pakistan any time in the near future. But much further away, agricultural products. What's so sensitive about an agricultural product?
So agriculture is an area where globally, not just in South Asia, but globally, this has been kept outside trade liberalization. And somehow the international community, because it's so political, because there are farmers, and somehow the rural people and farmers are, their constituency in terms of politics is considered extremely important. So whether you look at Japan, whether you look at Europe or look at United States, they have several and many sectors which have been allowed by the world community to be kept outside, right. Tariff concessions. So outside the WTO kind of framework, lots of restrictions. So similarly, so India, Pakistan, there are similar issues. Now, So Pakistan has, I understand, especially in some cereal products, there may be sensitivities, and we were just discussing in the seminar an hour ago, what is the best way to go forward on agriculture? Now, one way is certainly you backload it, keep it till the very end. But we were also saying that there are so many complementarities. For example, seasonalities. Tomatoes are produced in India and Pakistan, but they are produced at different times of the year. So actually, there's a very natural way of exporting them at times when the others, your harvest, I export. When I'm in shortage, when the other country has a harvest, they export to me. So there are those kinds of possibilities are there. When shortages develop, you can again, not just at the harvest cycle, but also any other shortages, again, there are big potential for exporting to each other. So I think, again, with will, there is nothing that is insurmountable. I think there are some very sensitive products which are in the sort of cereal category, and as I said, those can be kept out till the very end.
So in other words, what you're saying is that even without bringing in these sort of potentially sensitive, politically sensitive goods, we still have the potential for substantial improvement in trade. So Sanjay, even things that are allowed to be traded, there seems to be a large cost associated. You have this fact in your report that the cost of trade between India and Brazil on the other side of the world is less than the cost of trade between India and Pakistan. What do you mean by that? And where do those costs come from?
Yeah, so this is again empirical work, which is relative. This is relative cost. So compared to India Brazil, what does India Pakistan trade cost? And the data is revealing that's more expensive to trade between India and Pakistan, which is mind-boggling when you think about where Brazil is located and where Pakistan and India are located with each other. So the where this is coming from is essentially the what we just spoke about. One of them is this sensitive list. So you don't have such restrictions between normal trading partners, and India and Pakistan are not normal trading relations because there is not even MFN trade on one side, and so there is sensitive list, and there is also restrictions at the Wagah border, which is the most natural point of trading between the two countries. India is allowed to export only 138 products from the Wagah border to Pakistan. The rest have to go via the sea route, which is normally Karachi. And in the case of those 1,209 products, they have to come, if at all they come to Pakistan, they will come through some other country. So this creates big walls, obviously. And then there are restrictions on the Indian side as well. The sensitive list on the Indian side is there as well. I think it's about 600 odd products on the Indian side. So if these became normal trade, that's what I said, just as the way the rest of the world trade, if India and Pakistan were just to trade that way, we would get a big increase in exports. And so other things that are behind this is also, even trade that does happen at the Wagah border, the clearances take a very long time. So that increases the cost because time is money for businessmen. Because the customs agencies don't have electronic interfaces to talk to each other. So normally again in best practices, as a businessman, I would send my documents to the customs agency well in advance. And that my customs agency will send it to the partner country customs agency electronically. So actually by the time I reach the customs border, I am already cleared. I'm not a risky transaction. I'm already cleared on both sides of the border. This is best practice. But here what happens? An exporter from Pakistan first comes to the border, gets clearance from Pakistan, then goes to Atari, gets clearance from India. By the time that's happening, God knows how long has elapsed. And then finally, not only that, he has to exchange trucks, because we have this perverse thing in South Asia is there that the Pakistani truck cannot come into India and vice versa. So you have to transload all the equipment or the goods physically from the Pakistani truck into the Indian truck and then be taken across. So again, you can just imagine the inefficiency of this process.
A lot of that is just sort of trust issues, right?
Yes.
The lack of trust that a truck from the other side won't come in and have potentially weapons hidden or whatnot, whatever the distrust issues are. Are there examples of other countries in the world that don't really trust each other but have found a way to trade?
Yes.
and trade substantially more than us?
Yeah. I think you asked a very pertinent question. Look just at India. India and China. China is probably India's largest trading partner. I think trade is around $85 billion. China, Taiwan and China. They are thriving trading relationships, not just trade, even investment. There's a lot of Taiwanese investment into China, for example. So China and India, when it comes to trade, they have put aside their differences. So why, if India, Pakistan follow the India-China example, just that, right there, one country is a common factor.
Right.
So they have been able to put it. So of course the issue is, how did it get so big now that trade has become so important to both countries that there are very strong, as I said earlier, the constituencies to keep that trade going are very strong, which is a positive, because obviously as economists we want trade, we want business, we want there to be minimal disturbances, and this trade creates its own positive momentum. Once it's there so high, then it's harder to disrupt it, and that's our hope in South Asia also. You create this kind of constituency between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, whatever bilateral pairs. If you increase the trade so significantly that you develop strong positive lobbies to keep that trade going.
Absolutely. So I'll come to long run, what is potentially a potential future for Pakistan and India trade in just a bit. But first, let's just talk about the short run. So you're essentially saying, if I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, that of the items that are allowed to be traded, there's a further restriction in terms of whether it's barred from being traded in the cheapest possible way, which is the Wagah border. So does it make sense for the two countries to potentially invest in the technology and set up at the Wagah border, set up, for example, scanners or whatever else it requires to bring trust to the table in terms of trade from that point, and not even touch their negative lists. Just that, and is taking away this sort of bar of trade at Wagah, would that be a substantial improvement?
Yeah, I think so. The name of the game in South Asia, as in India-Pakistan relations, but overall in South Asia, the name of the game is incrementalism. That's the approach that we follow in the report. Small baby steps, concrete steps to nudge things forward, because each step is a win in the South Asian context, given the huge gap in current and potential trade and the mistrust, which we have a chapter in the report on the trust deficit. So any step that moves things forward is a good one. So not just the electronic scanners, but also it's the issue of, as I said, electronic data interchange. If we can do that, that will ease things. And right now I understand 100% checking, so there's no such thing as risk profiling. But if we can have electronic data interchange and develop risk profiles of traders, then eventually you should have best practice. Only a very low percentage, 2-3% should be physically checked. The rest should sail through on both sides on the basis of documentation. And that's why electronic data, that's where it would come into play. And that's best practice. Right? So right now we are at 100% checking, which is the one extreme of the most inefficient clearing process.
And then in the long run, in some sense I think of it as the price tag of our tensions. What is the benefit that could accrue from better trade?
Right. So the benefits are, so of course we said that trade enhances welfare. And I already talked about the numbers potentially, so there's physical exports possible. It is also, in trading terms, actually imports are equally important, if not more important than exports. Because imports are what determine consumption, and consumption is what ultimately determines welfare of the people. When I consume, that's when I gain, not when I'm actually exporting something. Exporting is a means to import, right? So, but exporting also gets you jobs, which allows you to consume. So exports are important, imports are also very important. So both sides, Pakistan would gain from that relationship. There would be potential, as we talked about, potential value chains, and there could also be services, trade in services. So as I said, the model is an underestimate. It's not a dynamic model. So that's, there are a lot of possibilities. Now, what could be possible knock-on effects? Supposing, you asked the question, supposing Pakistan were to trade more with India. Now, if the relationship is carried to its logical point, so you try to also develop connectivity. So now, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all three have signed the Global TIR Convention. That is a transit, it's global best practice, one of the great, very good international treaties for transit. 3 countries have signed it. If Nepal and Bangladesh were to sign this, then in theory, you could have a market, physical land, going through land, all the way from Kabul to Dhaka. Imagine the possibilities of trade in that. Pakistan could be exporting by land to, say, Nepal, to Bhutan, to Bangladesh, a prize market for Bangladesh, and vice versa. Bangladesh could also go across India, and India could be exporting to Afghanistan by land. So all of this comes into play through deeper, the next step of trade is connectivity, right? So the TIR convention. The second is, of course, the people-to-people connect that all this will mean. In the eastern part of South Asia, between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, you have this so-called, there's a motor vehicles agreement which was signed, which is trying to set up protocols for easy movement of vehicles for both trading as well as to people, tourist movement. So potentially a motor vehicles agreement could be set up in all of the countries where they share physical borders. So I think that is a big prize, for the region.
So I mean, those are decisions that obviously have to be taken at a political and strategic level, a lot of which we can't interface with in our profession. But I think it's very interesting that you've done this, because ultimately what we as economists can do is articulate the consequences of actions that are being taken, right? So again, the price tag of tension, if you want to think of it that way. We're also living in a world where, for example, SARC is under serious threat just because the countries can't decide who's going to have hosting rights and so on. Tensions again between India and Pakistan, and other tensions within South Asia. So within sort of keeping the focus on Pakistan, what potentially do you think could Pakistan do to optimize its trade if it is working under the constraint that it's not trading with India? That makes sense. So Pakistan's trade in South Asia minus India for political reasons. What could that look like? Is that already doing fairly well?
That's not doing very well. That would be very suboptimal for Pakistan, because currently Pakistan's foremost exports in the region are to Afghanistan, right? But potentially, obviously, the Indian market is the largest. Bangladesh is growing, but it's hard to, again, it will not be the most efficient of trade. Other than the land route would be the most efficient by rail, for example, connecting say Lahore and Dhaka by rail would be the most efficient form of trade in goods for Pakistan, and without India that will be hard to fulfill. You could of course have ships going from, say, Karachi to Chittagong, and that will be happening, but I don't know how the international feeder lines work, where there must be a lot of transshipment going on in that process. And then, you have potential value chain formation if India comes into play, which will not happen if India is not in play for Pakistan. So, whereas there is an apparel value chain, or a pharmaceutical value chain, or a sports goods value chain, all of these are of interest to Pakistan, or an auto value chain. It would not be efficient at all in these value chains if India is not part of Pakistan's outlook in formation. And value chains, as I said, I think earlier, is the most dynamic element in world trade, which means trade in parts and not only trade in final goods. And if let's say there is an identified hub in the region, let's say Bangladesh clearly is the hub for apparels, for garments, because it's now the second largest exporter in the world. it is already an incipient value chain there. Pakistan and India supply yarn and fabric and cotton. Sri Lanka supplies management and human management and technology, and also there is also management from India and Pakistan. So there is a value chain forming around Bangladesh. Similarly, could one think of value chains forming which have Pakistan as a base? Could there be a sports good value chain, for example? There is already India is already a global player in the auto sector. Could Pakistan and other countries feed into that Indian auto value chain? So these things of it would be very, very suboptimal for Pakistan not to engage.
That's a great point. So let me, sort of nearing the end of this conversation, let me bring this back to the Pakistan at 100 framework. We're trying to think of what Pakistan can be in 30 years, given the right policies. India is not just a regional rival and the source of Bollywood entertainment and our cricketing rival and all of that. It's also a great case study and sort of a point from which other countries can learn in terms of how to grow. Because starting from a very similar base, over the last 30 years or so, you've had a substantial growth, and some of it seems to come from trade. Can you talk a bit about what the evidence of that has been, and maybe just describe and give us an introduction to what that experience has been like?
Sure. Now, I just want to make a small point here that, because I don't represent India, I'm representing the World Bank,
Sure.
But of course I have studied India like I studied the other economies. So in the case of India, so there was a liberalization that began in 1991 after the crisis in India. And so from there till, I think India's exports really started taking off very soon after that. And really picked up steam, in the 2000s. And India became an increasingly important player in many sectors. But, now today India is a global player, for example, in the generic pharmaceuticals, in small cars, in motorcycles, in obviously the famous IT sector, the IT-enabled services sector. And it's getting also into the higher end of that value chain in IT. And in auto parts as well. So there are many sectors now where India is a global player. But it does take time because the economy is used to a very old way of doing things and used to protection. So there is pain. There is no gain without pain. So there was a lot of pain, a lot of sectors suffered, but then other sectors came up. I think the big challenge, of course, now is in India is the issue of jobs, but that's, we're not discussing that here today. But in terms of growth rates, both exports and imports, because as I said, they're two sides of the same coin, both of them grew very rapidly. And so the growth of imports allowed welfare to improve because you had, I remember, goods and services, especially goods, which were astronomically priced. And, my friends, relatives, people that, goods, people used to go to Singapore and Bangkok and Dubai and come back with stack loads of electronic goods, cassette recorders, televisions and all of that. Today India has some of the cheapest products in the world across a very wide range of products, right? So that's the most important part of trade is welfare of the people. And then exports growth has allowed, good quality jobs to emerge for those who have those kinds of jobs. But there will be pain for those sectors which will shrink as a result of liberalization. And as I said earlier, the economies and the policymakers have to learn and manage that, adapt, so that overall, as the economy hopefully is gaining overall, the losers are not allowed to become so dominant that they stymie the reform. So therefore you must take care in a very proactive way of losers, and especially in the losers I really mean the workers, because those are the people who we really care about in this process.
Well, Sanjay, this has been a very beneficial exchange of ideas for us. One hopes that we're able to get to exchange of goods and services with time. That's beneficial to both countries and to South Asia more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me for this. I really enjoyed it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.